So who are these angels and rulers that Paul mentions in Romans chapter 8, verse 38, when he says that nothing can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel.
And here we go.
I want to bring to your attention a really cool dissertation by Ronn Johnson. If you don't know the name Ronn Johnson wrote this dissertation at Dallas Theological Seminary in 2004. You can actually find it for free online at moreunseenrealm.com. But the title of this dissertation that he wrote back 21 years ago is The Old Testament Background for Paul's Use of Principalities and Powers. It's a really interesting title there. Ronn Johnson also kind of is carrying on the baton, the torch, after the passing of Dr. Michael Heiser back in 2023, I believe. So it's been over 2 years now since he's passed, and Ron and Mike were friends and colleagues, as etc. And Ron is a big part in this new podcast that has come about as a result of Dr. Heiser's passing, and that led to the end of the Naked Bible podcast. But this new podcast has come up that Ron often is on, and that's called the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Now, if there's two podcasts that I would like say, hey guys, go listen to these if you want to kind of get a better handle on the Divine Counsel worldview or the supernatural worldview of ancient Hebrews and Christians, then go listen to these two things. Dr. Michael Heiser did the Naked Bible, and Ronn Johnson, among others, is hosting this new Divine Counsel worldview podcast. Okay, why talk about the identity of these angels and rulers? From episode 1, where I read through the paper I wrote about 5 or so years ago, reenchantment leads to rediscovery, a lot of rediscoveries. When we kind of reenchant ourselves to understand the supernatural beliefs and worldview of ancient Hebrews and Christians, then that will lead to the rediscovery and re-understanding of, let's say, a lot of biblical passages. For instance, the biblical passages that relate to sexual ethics, like Romans 1. All right. And my contention is, it was, and it is, that reenchantment leads to rediscovery of an orthodox sexual ethic. And an orthodox sexual ethic is not affirming, as opposed to being affirming. Okay. And so I think Johnson's study shows us that the angels and rulers, specifically mentioned by Paul in Romans 8, are the gods of the Old Testament indirectly referenced in Romans 1, helping us to reenchant our reading of that passage that plays such a significant role in our understanding of same-sex sexual relationships, of homosexuality, gay marriage, etc. All right? Cool.
Can we get on with this, please?
So here's one place to start. One of the things Johnson says in his dissertation on page 199, which I believe is like the beginning of the conclusion chapter, he says Paul's reference to evil spiritual ruling powers, 8 times specified in the phrase arche kai exousia or archae kai exousiae, or principalities and powers is how it's translated, recalls the warning of the first commandment, in which the Elohim are deemed the spiritual antagonists to God's chosen people. You know, you would hear this a lot if you listened to and read and watched a lot of Dr. Heiser stuff. But you know, God in the 10 Commandments wouldn't tell the Israelites to not worship the other gods if the other gods didn't actually exist, right? And so what Johnson says here is like this phrase, principalities and powers, harkens back to, for instance, those rebel supernatural beings, those rebel Elohim, that in the Ten Commandments, in the first one or two of them, God says, don't worship them. I'm the Most High, worship me. Okay? An interesting observation.
Do not worship me!
Now, as he highlights throughout his dissertation, he says Paul uses this phrase, principalities and powers, about 8 times in his letters. Okay? And it's used both in the singular and in the plural. And here's where it shows up. 1 Corinthians 15:24, Ephesians 1:21, Ephesians 3:10, Ephesians 6:12, and that famous passage, right, about spiritual warfare. It also shows up in Colossians 1:16, Colossians 2:10, and Colossians 2:15. And finally, in Titus chapter 3, verse 1. So, 3 times in Ephesians, 3 times in Colossians, 1 time in 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection chapter, interestingly enough, and then 1 time in the letter to Titus. Okay, so there's the 8 times that this phrase pops up in Paul's letter that Johnson observes. Okay, great. Now, who are these guys? This is what his whole dissertation is about, is who are these principalities and powers that Paul regularly references as, not very specifically, but he uses this phrase, but he's using this phrase because I think as he argues, his audience knows who he's talking about, but we don't really, and that's the whole that's the whole problem, right? What ancient authors took for granted that their audience that they're writing to knew, we don't, as readers and the audience 2,000 plus years removed. Okay, but here's some of the things he says about these principalities and powers. These are unspecified identities, and it is a sort of hendiadys, which is a hendiadys is literally means like 1 through 2. Like it's a way of talking about one thing by means of 2 words with the conjunction "and" in the middle of it. It's a sort of hendiadys for powers, rulers, spheres of control, authorities, and officials. It's a stock phrase used by Paul and Luke and no other New Testament author. Okay, so only Paul and Luke in the New Testament use this phrase. And it's just one way for Paul to reference a vast host of unnamed spiritual powers. That's in chapter 6 of his dissertation.
I understood that reference.
All right. There's some general things that Johnson mentions about what this phrase means and who these principalities and powers are. Now, Johnson argues very specifically that the identity of these principalities and powers is garnered from, that Paul pulls from the Old Testament. All right. Paul, he says, relied on the Old Testament for his vocab on evil supernatural ruling powers. And here's where he goes into 4 lines of argumentation that he mentions in his conclusion, and that he spends his entire dissertation kind of putting together to build his argument. There's 4 lines of argumentation for the point that Johnson makes that, hey, these principalities and powers, actually, we know who they are because they're actually in the Old Testament, and that's where Paul pulls the identity of them from. So here we go. Here's number 1.
Lesson number 1.
Number 1, all right, is that the principalities and powers and let's say the evil supernatural ruling powers of the Old Testament, they're one and the same because they're similar in character. All right? They are both the principalities and powers and the evil supernatural beings of the Old Testament. They're similar in character because they're both creaturely antagonists to God and Christians. Creaturely meaning they're both created, and antagonists meaning they're both evil. They're opposed to Yahweh, the Most High. They're opposed to Jesus. They're opposed to the Great Commission. All right? They're opposed to the purposes of God, and therefore they're opposed to any and all persons who put their allegiance in Jesus as King. All right? So they're similar in character in that way. And Ron Johnson, he mentions a lot of different biblical passages to support this point. I'm trying to give a quick synopsis here. But if you want to look up what those passages are, find that dissertation online for free. It's really easy. Just search up Ron Johnson dissertation, and it'll show up on the first page on Google. Here's number 2, the second line of argumentation.
Does number 2 work for?
The principalities and powers that Paul references in his New Testament letters are the same as the Old Testament evil supernatural Elohim of the Old Testament. Why? Because they're both similar in role. For instance, they're ruling spirits of the present era, given temporal rule over humans on earth according to the ultimate pleasure of Yahweh. But they both became disloyal. Okay? So these evil supernatural beings, they've been given rule over this world in the present era. And that rule is temporal. Okay? And that rule is dependent upon Yahweh's say-so. That rule will ultimately be taken away from them, all right, ultimately by Jesus. But that rule will be taken away from them particularly because they became disloyal. And they work against Yahweh rather than for him due to that rebellion. So they're similar in character and they're similar in role. Okay? Number 3.
Please bring her to window number 3.
The principalities and powers in Paul's New Testament letters are the same as the evil supernatural Elohim of the Old Testament because they're similar in destiny. Okay, once their rule is taken away from them, what happens to them? Well, Ron Johnson talks about how they're destroyed after a period of servitude, and there may have been no greater theme for Paul to be found in the gospel than that of borrowed authority coming back to its rightful place. The future subjugation of spiritual powers is a strong, recurring theme in the New Testament. And it kind of blows your mind, all the biblical passages that Ron Johnson puts forward as a means of substantiating this point, this line of argumentation. And it's one that you don't, at least in my experience growing up at church, that we didn't discuss very much at all, let alone understand. Here from the pulpit, discussing Sunday school, Bible class, what have you. But they're both similar in destiny, both the principalities and powers and the evil supernatural Elohim of the Old Testament. Their power will be taken away from them. All right. It'll go back to its rightful place, namely Jesus, and they will ultimately be punished. Okay. And it's a huge, huge theme in the New Testament, though at this point you might not have observed or realized it yet. And the fourth line of argumentation.
You have to make number 4.
They're similar in titles, both the principalities and powers in Paul's letters and the evil supernatural Elohim of the Old Testament. Similar in titles. Rulers, archai, and authorities, exousiai. All right. These, and this is really cool, Johnson observes that these specific titles were found to be used in the very Septuagint text, which functioned as the climax of the Son of Man vision in the book of Daniel in chapter 7, verses 26 and 27. These beings, okay, these ruling powers, these ruling spirits, these Elohim that became disloyal and rebelled against Yahweh, they're referenced as principalities and powers, rulers and authorities. These same Greek terms that Paul uses to talk about them are actually used in the book of Daniel in the Septuagint. So Paul takes the terminology that he uses in his letters straight from his Bible, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which we call the Septuagint, referenced as LXX, the acronym LXX. So boom, that observation is a big one. And it's really cool. If you look at his continued discussion on this point in his dissertation, again, for free online, I think the point that he makes is an observation he makes is pretty solid. Paul gets his terminology, principalities, powers, rulers, authorities, straight from the Septuagint, the Old Testament. Okay.
Supernatural stuff.
So, in another portion of his dissertation, Johnson includes this power language in the New Testament list. Now, in our case, we're talking about Romans here. The phrase principalities and powers isn't found in the book of Romans. But in this power list that Johnson puts in his dissertation, he's got a list of, like, let's say one of the categories is pairs of words. Another category is listing that appears to work with pairs in mind. And in both instances, he puts Romans 8:38 in those categories in that power list of the New Testament. And the phrase angels and rulers is that phrase that's associated with Romans 8:38. Angels and rulers, powers and principalities, not powers and principalities, just angels and rulers. I'm going to get my lines crossed here. Okay. And so that's interesting. Now, the question that pops up into my mind is, okay, are these one and the same thing? Are the angels and rulers the same things, the same beings as the principalities and powers, and therefore the rebel, supernatural, evil Elohim of the Old Testament? Let's talk about that. Okay, so here's this list that Paul gives us in Romans 8:38 and 39 at the end of, like, the first half section of the letter of Romans. And he's like, hey, all these things can't separate you from God through Jesus Christ, right? And here's these all these pairs that he gives us. He's got the pairing of death and life, the pairing of angels and rulers, the pairing of things present and things to come, the pairing, the just singular powers. It's not paired with anything else in the list. And then height and depth are paired together. And then a singular, any other created thing, Paul says, no other created thing can separate you from God through Jesus Christ. Okay. All these things seem also to be a little somewhat metonymic, right? Just like the phrases we talked about in Romans chapter 1 were metonyms in a previous video. Like death and life perhaps could be metonyms for the supernatural powers, right? The evil Elohim. But here we're talking about angels and rulers. Who are these guys? But angels and rulers finds itself within this listing of 10 different things. All right. And it almost kind of appears that they're all talking about the same thing, just in different ways. Right. All right. So who are these guys? I guess my argument is that the phrase angels and rulers is synonymous with principalities and powers. Here's one of the things that Ronn Johnson says in his dissertation leading up to his concluding chapters in his work. He says about angels. Now, Paul's use of angeloi had the general host of heaven in mind. All right. Again, angels is a function. It's a title. It's not so much referring to like a class of beings like Elohim. Like an Elohim can be an angel in terms of it's given a task to go bring a message to somebody else. That's what angel means. But Paul's use of angeloi had the general host of heaven in mind. So it's almost functions synonymously with Elohim. In intertestamental literature, here we go. I'm getting ahead of myself. In intertestamental literature, spiritual beings came to be known by different titles, often depicted as angeloi, whether in word-for-word translation or in context. So Elohim and angeloi are found to generally function interchangeably, both in intertestamental literature and in the Septuagint, leading to New Testament writers using this very same vocab. So Paul's use of angels is, like with principalities and powers, referencing the evil, supernatural Elohim of the Old Testament. Now, Not every Elohim, not every angel is evil, obviously, rebellious, but within context, it's referring to those evil, rebel Elohim of the Old Testament.
Angel.
Now, here's something interesting that I found in the Word Biblical Commentary by Dunn in the book of Romans. He has this chart here, and this chart is talking about the sequence of 10 terms that Paul uses in this list in Romans 8, 38, and 39. So here, I'm just going to read it. So too, the sequence of 10 items in verses 38 and 39 has several partial parallels in the Pauline corpus. And you got death and life both mentioned as again in 1 Corinthians 3:22 and in Philippians 1:20. Very interesting. Angeloi isn't mentioned anywhere else, at least in this chart that Dunn has created, in any other Paul letters, but he does include 1 Peter 3:22 because it seems like he's arguing for Pauline authorship of 1 Peter, but I think that's debatable. But archai, look where this pops up elsewhere in Paul's letters that he mentions here in this graph. 1 Corinthians 15:24, Colossians 1:16, 2:10, 15, Ephesians 1:21, 3:10, 6:12. So archai is that same term that's used in the principalities and powers phrase. And so it seems to be one of Paul's favorite terms to use to reference evil supernatural beings, right?
It's my favorite name.
So just wanted to give you a quick look at that and what Dunn helped us observe in Paul's letters. Here's something else. So both angels and rulers occur for the only time in Romans right here. Let's just sit with that observation for a moment. The only time that the term angels and rulers appears in Paul's letter to the Romans is right here in Romans 8, 38, and 39. Pretty crazy in that list of 10 things. I think that's very, very significant. And like I mentioned just before, another important observation is rulers, archai, is the most frequently used name for angelic and demonic powers in Paul's listings. And I got these two observations once again from Dunn's Word Biblical Commentary on the book of Romans. Again, two really important observations to make right there. And so this verse, let's say Romans 8:38, is very, I would say, very important within the book overall in terms of understanding what Paul's doing, saying, meaning, right? Okay. So two really cool observations. So Paul's identification of these powers, these rulers and authorities, or the synonymous angels and rulers, we can say, let's say in terms of one concluding thought, one thing we can say is that rulers and authorities, powers and principalities, angels and rulers, these are synonymous phrases. They mean the same thing. They're referring to the same thing. But these phrases and these terms, they're not original to Paul, right? He's getting them, all of them, from his Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible and the Greek translation of his Bible, the Septuagint, which was like the missionary Bible for Paul and the early Christians. So all these terms, all these phrases refer back to the Rel Elohim of the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. All right, that's one, I guess you could say, concluding thought here to wrap this up so we don't go much longer.
Maybe. Yeah, but at least I won't be unoriginal.
Okay, here's another thought. And I think I got this from Dunn again as well. Not Dunn again, Dunn again. More striking still is the way that Romans 8, 31 through 39 serves to sum up the whole argument to this point. So what Dunn is showing us in his commentary is like, hey, chapter 8 is wrapping up the entire first half of the book of Romans that began in chapter 1, as we'll see here in, let's say, the terminology, the vocab that Paul is kind of using once again that he used heavily in chapters 1 and 2. So here's a couple examples. All right. Paradidomi or paradoken, Obviously, it was used 3 times in chapter 1. That really important term of being handed over is found in verse 32. We made a whole video about that one. All right. It's also found in chapter 4:25 and 6:17. Takayu, found in verse 33 of chapter 8. Well, that's also found in chapters 2:13. It's found a total of 13 times in the book, I believe. Katakrino, found in chapter 8, verse 34. It's also found in chapter 2, verse 1, and then earlier on in chapter 8, verse 3. Okay? Thlipsis and Stenoxoria, I think that's how you pronounce it, found in chapter 8, verse 35, is found way back in chapter 2, verse 9. Chapter 2, verse 9 is in the same discourse that begins with chapter 1, verse 18, that runs all the way to chapter 2, verse 11. Okay? And then Katisis, that we see, I think that's translation is creation, all created things, no created, any other created thing can't separate us from the love of God. That's found in verse 39. Well, that same term is found in chapter 1, verse 20 and 25, and then earlier on in chapter 8, and chapter 8, 19 through 22. So these are just a few examples that Dunn shows us of observing how Paul's wrapping up the entire first half of his letter that began in chapters 1 and 2. He's wrapping up here in chapter 8. I think that's really important to observe because this helps us make the observation and conclusion that the rulers, angels and rulers, in verse 38 of chapter 8, is actually, they're specifically referred to here that Paul indirectly refers to in chapter 1 in terms of who God hands humanity over to, right? For those 3 times that term is used.
Come on, let's wrap this up.
So here we go. Here's my final slide and final thought for this video. So the point is this, that I just got ahead of myself again. We've got good confirmation from Johnson's dissertation that the angels and rulers of Romans 8:38 are the Old Testament Elohim that God hands humanity over to in Romans 1. All right, I just mentioned that. And thus, Johnson's dissertation helps us see why Heiser considered Romans chapter 1 to be the best place to see the Deuteronomy 32 worldview in the New Testament. And a final thought, Johnson's dissertation and conclusions about the powers and principalities, which again is this synonymous term with angels and rulers. Johnson's dissertation helps us reenchant our reading of Romans 1, 18 through 2:11, and therefore leads us towards a non-affirming sexual ethic as it reenchants our understanding of Paul's words there in that passage at the beginning of the book of Romans. Now, if you want to go back and watch previous videos where I kind of go into that more, please do so. But I'm going to stop right here in terms of just making this overall video, just wanting to draw this connection between the angels and rulers of Romans 8:38 and the very ones that God hands humanity over to in chapter 1, and how Johnson's dissertation once again helps us re-enchant our reading and backs up Heiser's contention that Romans 1 is again the best place in the New Testament to see his Deuteronomy 32 worldview, his divine counsel worldview at play, and how that worldview, thinking like an ancient Hebrew and Christian, helps us understand the biblical story overall, but especially the argument that Paul is making at the beginning of what many people consider to be his most important letter. All right, guys, I hope you really enjoyed this video. I know I did in terms of making it, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall.